Welcome to the ThinkData Podcast in partnership with Dataworks. And today I'm really excited to be joined by Tomas Reemers. He is the co-founder and chief product officer of Graphite. They are a Series B startup redefining code review. To the engineers and the technical folk listening, this is a must listen podcast. He's really going to share how Graphite have validated that demand, grew without traditional marketing, which we're going to take a closer look at because they went on this kind of education community-led approach, and stays ahead of others in this space. So yeah, really good to have you on. And obviously we've talked on offline briefly, but for those that haven't heard, and as I say, we have got a mainly technical audience here, what problem were you trying to solve with Graphite, and how did that idea kind of come about? Because obviously you're a co-founder, so there's obviously a couple of you involved in this company. So yeah, talk to me about the kind of evolution of this.
Absolutely, Alex. And first of all, thank you for having me on. Super excited
Pleasure.
to get to share with our listeners on sort of what Graphite's doing and why. So to give you a cheeky answer to what problem were we trying to solve, our own. So Graphite actually did not start as a code review company at all. We started as a company helping build tools for QA people for mobile apps. I came from Facebook. I had a great career there. I absolutely loved it. I ended up, when I left, I had two of my old teammates who wanted to join me. We ended up sort of coming out into the wild, as we call it, and starting to build our QA software. And one of the things that we realized along the way was, wow, we really miss Facebook's internal developer tooling. Facebook has some really best-in-class developer tooling. For those of you who have never worked there, the way I would think around it is GitHub built pull requests back in around 2011, 2013. Facebook did too, but they've just been constantly iterating on it relentlessly since then. And so when we talk around them being almost a decade in the future innovation-wise, that is a quite literal statement to me. And so we came out here, we started to interact with GitHub, and at first we were like, oh, this is quite different. And I think at the time we were just like, we must be the weird ones. We know we had used GitHub before. We had gone to Facebook. We had gotten used to that tooling. So leaving, we were like, oh, there'll be an adjustment period. And after about 6 months of that, we were like, no, we don't think this is different. We think that what Facebook had was actually really special. How do we start to recreate that? And so we started to build it bit by bit for ourselves. And I guess the next part is sort of where the company really happened was a lot of our old teammates would leave Facebook, Meta at that point, would go on to their startups, would talk to us around, wow, code review out here is really different than I remember, to which we'd respond, it is, but we solved it so you can solve it too. And then they started to tell us, actually, I don't want to solve it. Can I use what you've built? And that was the beginning of what has now been a 4-year journey into redefining code review.
Interesting. And for the alluded to the point that there's obviously a hugely kind of technically led audience to this podcast. There's also the ones that listen are curious about AI and innovation, which I know we're obviously going to get a deeper look at. But for the non-technical audience, what is Graphite and kind of what problem are you solving?
Absolutely, and appreciate you taking the step back. So code review is this peer review process that all engineers go through. So when I work at a company as an engineer, I can't just release code to my users. Instead, I need at least one or maybe many other engineers at the company to say, hey, this code that you've written, this looks good. You're welcome to release it to engineers. That process is called code review. At its heart, there are two things to do. There's what do I need to look at? And then does this look good to ship? And if it doesn't look good to ship being jargon for release to users, if it doesn't look good to ship, well, what do I need to tell you such that you can update it, such that we can get it to a place that it looks good to ship? If there's anyone who's worked with lawyers in the room, it's very familiar to redlining. If there are people who have worked in design in the room, it's very similar to critique. The difference here being that most engineers engage with code review at very least daily. And so that's the core of what we're trying to do. I'd say that with AI, a lot of this has become a lot more relevant. So Graphite started doing code review full-time in 2022, if I recall, very end of 21. And at the time, we were solving a problem that was primarily felt by big companies. What's really interesting is as AI continues to get better, we're seeing this problem felt by everyone. I think one of the ways I think around that right now is everyone's so obsessed with how does AI change software engineering? And the obvious answer is, well, more code will be written. But if more code is written, what needs to happen, you know? Well, then more code needs to be reviewed. And if more code is reviewed, what else needs to happen? Well, more code needs to be tested and merged and deployed, right? There are all of these other parts after the code is written that, because of the volume being created by AI, both agents and assistants, we now are having much higher volume on the other side. I think one meme we've seen on Twitter a lot is that review is now the bottleneck. It's no longer around being able to author the code. That part's actually getting very fast. It's now about being able to keep up, review, and integrate that volume of code.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So you obviously, I kind of think back to your days at Meta or back then with Facebook. Obviously, they've obviously had this platform well ahead of its time. You've gone, obviously, you're almost validating the use case and the need because your ex-colleagues were saying, hang on a minute, what you're building there. But you talked about the growth, because obviously 4 years back, you had that eureka moment. You obviously knew there was a problem that needed solving. There was obviously a need, but I touched on it at the intro that you kind of went a bit untraditional in terms of the marketing. Typically, you'd build this kind of outbound machine and demand gen and start feeding the market with lots of campaigns, but you didn't. You went the education and community-led approach. What does that mean in practice, and what worked and what didn't?
Certainly. So going back to, I think, one of the main changes that Graphite makes on top of GitHub is our fundamental workflow. So one of the changes that both GitHub, Google, and other large tech companies have is this idea of stacking. Now, if you're a developer in the room, that word might be as unfamiliar to you as it is to the non-developers in the room. The idea of stacking, said in one sentence, is what if your changes, instead of all being on top of the single source of truth that the company has, were based on each other? The reason why you might want to do that is that you have your code base as a company and you want to build, let's say, a sign-in feature, and you build that sign-in feature. Normally what happens is the developer pauses there because they're like, I've built the feature. I now need to get it approved and ship it to my users before I can continue to develop on top of that. Instead, stacking says, don't stop there. Keep writing the next feature. Write forget password, which depends on a lot of the same code, but normally you'd be blocked on. And you know what? The tooling's going to handle, if you end up needing to update sign-in, it'll integrate those updates into your remaining changes. And so it allows the developers to keep working even while they wait on review. That's the real magic of stacking. Now, to many developers, if you've worked at big tech, or honestly, if you've been working with Git, the most common source control, for long enough, you've probably seen or tried this workflow. To many others, they hadn't. And so by necessity, we started with a community-led and teaching approach because we had this new workflow that we needed to start teaching people about. And it wasn't enough. When we thought about it at the beginning, we played very briefly with doing ads. We played very briefly with trying to sort of just spread the word. And what we found were people ended up asking us, well, hold on, like, can you sit down and explain this with me? And so we had to take this education-led, thought leadery, okay, how can we talk around the future of code review and bring people along for that journey, not just throw something in their face and show them what it is.
It's really interesting. Obviously, it shows how intuitive and knowledgeable you are within your space. As obviously a coder yourself, and you've been in these spaces, but you're stacking, as you rightly say, to some it's very, oh yeah, I get it, I understand the benefits of it, but actually to a lot of people probably less common, or in practice they're probably not aware they're doing it. So when you look at Graphite as a business, do you think a lot of what's happening at the moment, certainly if you throw AI into the mix, it is about a re-education of the way engineers develop and work together? Because I think there's a lot I'm fortunate enough to speak to from either recruitment or the podcast that engineers, they're going to be displaced, they're gone, AI is going to replace them. But on your point earlier, there still needs to be more code review. Do you think we're seeing an evolution of the engineer as opposed to the replacement? Or I know Graphite's obviously right in center of that.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you bring this point up. It is such a common point, and one we spend so much time talking around. I believe that what AI is going to do is it's going to accelerate I'm going to call it the growth of companies, but I don't mean that in headcount. What I mean is that typically when you look at the software development lifecycle, there are problems that small companies face, medium companies face, and large companies face. And some of them are the same, but a lot of them are actually different. And at distinct stages, you end up with different problems. With AI, I think every small company is starting to look like a medium company. because they don't only have their engineers, they also have their AI agents. They also have people assisting those engineers. They have a lot of tooling just making them write even more code than they ever could before. And the medium companies are starting to look like large companies. And so I don't believe that the engineer is going to be displaced
Mm.
because I don't think that AI can fully replace what an engineer does, but I think that each individual will be able to accomplish more. And I think because of that, these companies are going to start looking order of magnitude larger than they have in the past and will be accomplishing order of magnitude more than they ever did in the past. And that's going to be really exciting.
It is exciting. I'm glad you said that as well, because I think people listening to this, there is obviously a lot of doom mongering. Look, bad press travels more quickly, doesn't it? I think actually, if you look at what you're saying here, it's actually been echoed by a few founders I've been fortunate enough to speak to, where it's just going to allow you to deploy code quicker. It's going to allow you to change that code more effectively, and build better products quicker. And the next $1 billion business, it's probably going to be on under 50 people. We're already starting to see that.
I think that's super real, and I think there'll be more businesses as a result of it. But then more than that, like really getting at the feelings, I think that I spend all my day talking to developers. I love developers. I'm a developer myself. I've been writing code since I was real young. I think one of the things that developers almost forget is the reason I became a developer wasn't to do a lot of the stuff that AI is automating, right? It wasn't to fix the unit test. It was to solve a really hard problem, or it was to build a really impactful feature. And I think what AI is doing to a lot of developers, and I think that actually the most interesting trend I'm seeing, to take a tangent, is I'm seeing people that used to be developers who are becoming developers again. And they're like, I was a developer. It got unfun. Just after a while, you get tired of having to think around all of the things that you do in a modern development workflow. Well, I no longer have to. The AI is actually able to do a lot of that for me and to let me focus on the fun parts about being a developer. And I think that trend's going to only continue in a really positive way.
Yeah, and I'm all for it. I think you're right. I think you've seen a lot of people move to that middle manager layer who's become a bit hands-on, doing code reviews. And actually, I'm seeing it myself. People are wanting to get more hands-on. There's more exciting tooling to play with nowadays, and I think you're kind of missing out. Is my personal belief. I'm really keen to kind of drill down on this kind of exclusivity of the product you created by that waitlist model, where you obviously had people on a waitlist. Instead of saying, right, we're opening it up to everyone, you actually created excitement. It's like the busy restaurant, isn't it? When you call out, it's always booked. You think, oh, I really want to go to that place. Talk about the model and why you adopted that first, as opposed to getting everyone on it and then learning from their feedback.
It's a really good question. So one of the things that I like to remind every new hire who starts at Graphite is that code review is a really wide problem. What I mean by that is that I think the canonical startup advice is to take some wide problem space and try to narrow it as much as you can, right? The problem with code review, and then solve that one really small thing. The problem with code review in my eyes is code review without syntax highlighting, which is the way that developers read code, without diffing, the way to tell what's changed, without code owners or reviewer assignment, the ways that you have ownership in a code base, without title or descriptions or the various integrations that include their embeddings and things like that, is totally meaningless. And so I think that code review actually at the start is a very wide problem. And because of that, you have to really narrow in not just on what you're choosing to solve, but on the specific workflows you're solving for. And I think one of the really interesting things is that every company has I think every developer listening probably is like, well, there's one way to do code review. And after having had this user interview hundreds of times, I can promise you, maybe thousands, I don't know, tens of thousands. What I can promise you is everyone does it slightly differently, and the tools they have are slightly different. And so part of the waitlist for us was just sheer necessity of there's too many workflows here. We really need to narrow in on a few that we're really going to care about and get right. And then we're going to expand from there. And so that was thought number one. Thought number two is, as we think around sort of our product philosophy and how we build products or how we build a dev tools, I heard someone frame this to me recently and I really like it. It's you should focus to get your users to not feel like users, but to feel like members. And what I mean by that is not that you should have a membership structure. That's not what I mean. Or that you should have a subscription model. That's maybe you should. That's not really my point in saying this. What I mean by that is you want to be something that they would be happy identifying as. And I think it's really hard to do that if you're just trying to serve the lowest common denominator of users. I think you want to find some user who really loves what you're solving and who wants to identify by that, and you want to appeal to them. And you want to get that really, really right before you expand to more and more and more users. And so for us, just narrowing the pool was an easy way to do that.
Mm.
As we've expanded, it's been a hard thing to keep. I'm not going to lie, right? I think as you end up making opinionated product decisions where you're going to piss off people on both sides, no matter how you make it. And so the best you can do is say, you know what, this is where I've earned the right to push back on you all. I think that this is a better solution, stacking being one example of that, where I know that it's going to make you more effective. I get that not everyone's going to get it, and we're going to have some opinions around it. But I believe that if you trust me, you're going to get to a better place. And the people that do see the value, they see the impact. The average org that adopts Graphite 1 month after adopting Graphite tends to produce 3 times as many pull request units of change per developer than they did before. That is an
Wow.
insane statement, right?
That
And
is,
that we can say
yeah.
that is super cool. But you have to kind of lead there, and then they start, and it's changed, and it's different, and it feels bad. And you have to say, like, hold on for a month, and in a month, you get to deliver impact, which is really
Yeah,
cool.
well, when you're saying statements like that, then obviously it makes sense, and people should have that kind of light bulb moment. But it's always about, for me, it's all about the education and the messaging, isn't it? About, you may have worked along those, lifetime engineers, developers, they've always programmed like this. And actually then a new product like Graphite comes along, and they're not kind of, they don't want to adopt it, but they're just not used to adopting new tools. So how do you educate those engineers generally about the benefits the product brings? Because it's all well and good, obviously internally,
Yeah.
your team, you're all like, this is going to change the way you develop, but how do you explain and how do you ensure that you're not telling them what to do, but educating on the benefits of changing?
Yes. I think one of the things that you're maybe saying implicitly that I'll say explicitly is that developers hate to be marketed to; they need to be educated,
Yeah, I
right? Like
do. Completely.
there's a part of them which, and I think again, I identify as a developer here as well. Like there's a part of you which it is literally your job to learn new technologies every day, and so you've gotten past the point where it's this person said it, so I'm going to do it. You're instead being a critically thinking sort of individual who's saying, okay, I get that you think I should I should use it, but why should I actually use it?
Mm.
And so they really want to understand that. So at the very beginning, stacking now, which is like at the heart of Graphite, and I think that there's a lot of, so I have 2 answers for you. One, there are a lot of parts of Graphite which I think are just easy for developers to adopt that require no change in workflow, but are just strictly benefits. One example of this is their inbox. So in GitHub, there's not an easy native way to find all of the pull requests or those actions of code that you need to like pay attention to right now. There are ways to search for them in the past. There are ways to see the ones you've authored or the ones that you're currently awaiting your review. But if you were to say in one place, just what is my like to-do list for the day, that view does not exist. Graphite offers that view, as I think every major company has. And so that's one of those features of Graphite we can put in front of those users. No explanation necessary. We're like, those 15 different bookmarks you have? Here it is. And they're like, this is awesome. And you're like,
Yeah.
great. Stacking has been probably one of the most impactful parts of our workflow, but also the hardest to explain. At the very beginning, we didn't start by teaching it, actually. What we started by was finding people that already understood it. So we look for those former Facebookers, those former Googlers, those former people that came from, there's a wide range of companies. Uber and Twitter did as well. And we'd go to them and we'd be like, hey, you remember stacking that workflow you loved at this company? And they're like, absolutely, I miss it every day. And you're like, great, I have it for you. And they're like, perfect. And then what we would do is we'd equip them with tools to teach their coworkers. And what I mean by tools I mean like one-page documents they can share, microsites they can share, very clean documentation that they can share. These are the kinds of things that you would almost give it to them and be like, hey, you go be the teacher. You understand the workflow better than I do, and you have more rapport with them. Go do that.
Interesting.
Over time, we evolve that. So obviously you reach a natural limit there at some point. And then you start to focus on, okay, how can I put this in front of productivity hackers is how I describe them. There's this class of engineer who really cares about their personal productivity and who also is not on a tight deadline. Because I think there's many engineers that care about productivity but are on tight deadlines. And if you go to them with new tooling, they're like, that sounds great. I'll look at it sometime else.
It's never going to happen.
It's right. Never. It's going to happen over Christmas, probably, which is one of the times when we see a lot of developers play with tools. I mean that super sincerely. But for us, when we're trying to sort of think around how do we get people to adopt it today, It's around finding that productivity who happens to be in between projects or happens to be on a little bit more of a chill project. Maybe they just finished a big sprint, and going to them and saying, hey, here's this really cool workflow. Let's make it easy for you to try. And I think what we've seen with them is how do we bake that into the product? So we started with a lot of documentation and tooling sort of on websites, on microsites, etc. And that was fine and dandy. But what really made a step function difference for us was when we made so Graphite is installed into your command line as GT, when we made the GT demo command. And the GT demo command right there in the product runs you through a demo of how to use it. And what we see is that people that use that get it. They hit the next few key actions and milestones very fast after that because they see what they need to do and it makes intuitive sense to them, and then they start doing it. Yeah. And that's really, really, really cool.
And it's the impact, isn't it, of having multiple people on that journey who then start talking to their colleagues, their co-workers, then that kind of symbiotic kind of, everyone just goes, well, why aren't you doing it? Why aren't you?
And then they start blogging about it. And then they start tweeting at each other. And exactly what you're saying, Alex. And then they just go take it from there. And so that was a really big difference for us. And I think actually the change that's happened right now that I think is happening more in the marketing world than it is in the developer world, but we're paying very close attention to it, is that I'll give you some loose thoughts and maybe we can structure these together, is that if we teach your coding agent how to stack, so if we teach Codex or Gemini or Claude Code or Cursor, hey, here's how you can create this stacking workflow, it actually gets it. It gets it really well. It's already in its training set, and so it's figured out what to do. And what's really interesting about that is that it seems like if someone's AI agent shows them the core workflow, it's actually okay. It's actually okay if it's not a person, it's just an agent, because the person who's using that agent will then be like, oh, I get this. This is good. I should do this myself. And then they learn it themselves. And so I think before we really focused on how do we get your teammate to learn this, I think that strategy is still right. I just think teammate's been broader than human teammate. It's also AI teammate or coding assistant.
Exactly. You got these unseen teammates at the moment now, I think, which has just become more and more. And I think it's really interesting because it's like the more I listened to it and the more research I was doing, yes, you created a great product, but you've also created this movement where there's this kind of not so much a shift away, but actually just a shift to what how it should be. There's no surprise the organizations, the Facebooks, the Metas, the Googles have got such large engineering teams ship code quicker than any of it, because obviously the setup they had internally enabled them to do that. So I think it's really interesting you've approached the education, the kind of, it just makes sense model. What kind of feedback do you get from engineers about, future proofing this, concept and ideas? And what I mean by that is, I think you said at the beginning of the intro, the rate at which AI is progressing, more startups are coming, more competition are going to be appearing in your space, more people are going to be copying what you've done. But how do you ensure that your engineers continue to adopt it and continue to use, and your business continues to grow?
Yeah, I think you're asking a few separate questions in there. So I'll try and pull them apart and answer them separately. Question number one is things are changing. Definitely. I think one of the craziest indicators I always look at are Hacker News and Reddit as two popular news sites to figure out what's the public sentiment here. And I think over time, this idea of stacked PRs or stacking or stack diffs has actually increased quite noticeably. It's really interesting to me that I remember our first launch post on HN, everyone was like, what is this workflow? And today, whenever I read something on source control, it's like, well, how does this work with stacking? And so that's been a really interesting secular trend to just watch of people sort of adopting it. The wildest example of that to me was I was at a developer meetup describing what Graphite does, code review. And someone asked me oh yeah, does your platform have support for stacking? And it was funny to me where my thought was we are the ones who introduced that term. That's crazy to me that this has come full circle now.
Yeah.
Yes, of course we do. We're happy to support you there. So that's one. Two, how do we make sure that developers continue to adopt this workflow? I think the most important thing right now for anyone building any developer tool is to make it usable for AI agents as well. I believe very firmly that a lot of code in the future is going to be written at least in part by AI agents. I'm pretty certain it's not all of it. I think developers are going to have jobs for a long horizon, but I think that the way I think around this is sort of like web frameworks of if your web framework is something that an LLM is uncomfortable writing, it will probably become less popular over time because the LLMs are dictating how a lot of code is written.
Mm.
The third question you asked me was, how is my business set up for this? And how are we thinking around continuing to exist in a future where there's more competitors and faster competition than ever? My belief is stay focused. I think I really subscribe to the belief of you should know what your competition is doing, but don't over pivot on them. I think that we have been thinking around code review for 5 years now. It's a thing we like live and breathe. We go to sleep around thinking around, and we wake up thinking about it.
Yeah.
And so I think that while competition can copy what we have, I think one of the things that we see some competitors sometimes do is make mistakes or things that we did earlier in our journey, not out of any reason. I know why they made them. I made the same mistakes myself. They're just earlier in the journey.
Yeah.
And so I think I think the way you stay relevant is leveraging this knowledge that we've built. We've been doing this for 5 years. We've been thinking around it deeply. I think there were other companies we could have started if our goal was just to like exit or get rich quickly. We care about this because we're developers who are really, really passionate around what we're building. And I think that's going to carry us into a long horizon.
Yeah, I love that. And look, I think it's probably just a suitable point to kind of summarize and bring this to a close. So I think what I've loved, and I think that our technical kind of listeners will really understand the benefit graphite brings. I think, without being too kind of futuristic about this, you have created a movement. There is this movement and the shift away, not necessarily shift away, but a shift to how it should be. And obviously as engineers, it's a product built by engineers. This is a product built by people from that space. The way you've released it into the market, the way that people have adopted it. And I love the kind of term about the members. Everyone feels part of the journey. They're kind of blogging about it. They're talking about it in meetups. I think for you, it's exciting. And I'm really confident that we're going to begin to continue to see your growth. But if people are curious, if people are listening, I've obviously played on your website and people can look at how it works in practice. Is that fair? So people can log on the website and have a play around with it?
Yeah, Graphite.dev. We're here. We love people signing up. We love people playing around with it. I still think the best way a lot of developers learn is to just go headfirst into something. And so we embrace that. Would love to see people sign up.
100%. Well, Thomas, look, it's been a load of fun this afternoon, and thanks so much for coming on. It's a fascinating product, and I think what you guys are doing are great.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me,
Cheers,
Alex.
Thomas. Thank you.
Cheers.